Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, she, they, and this is Literally Graphic. And this week I'm looking at Poppies of Iraq by Brigitte Findakly and Lewis Trondheim. Translation by Helge Dasher, published by Drawn & Quarterly in 2017. After finishing Maggie Garrison, realizing that it was written by the same person as Alien, Archives of Lost Issues, and Earthly Editions of Extraterrestrial Novelties, I looked back through Lewis Trondheim's other work and saw this really interesting nonfiction collaboration with their wife, colorist Brigitte Findakly, and knew I had to read it ASAP. Content notes for execution, guns, a butcher at work, suicidality, and warfare. The nature of the violence, as with what feels like a majority of books I read, is fairly static with single-panel observations. This is not an action-adventure comic by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, as a memoir, author description and book summary really meld together, so here is the latter. Drawn from Goodreads, quote, Poppies of Iraq is Brigitte Findakly's a nuanced, tender chronicle of her relationship with her homeland, Iraq, co-written and drawn by her husband, the acclaimed cartoonist Lewis Trondheim, in spare and elegant detail. They share memories of her middle-class childhood, touching on cultural practices, the educational system, Saddam Hussein's state control, and her family's history as Orthodox Christians in the Arab world. Poppies of Iraq is intimate and wide-ranging, the story of how one can become separated from one's homeland and still feel intimately connected, yet ultimately estranged. Signs of an oppressive regime permeate a seemingly normal life. Magazines arrive edited by customs. The color red is banned after the execution of General Kassim. Baathist militiamen are publicly hanged and school children are bussed past them to bear witness. As conditions in Mosul worsen over her childhood, Brigitte's father is always hopeful that life in Iraq will return to being secular and prosperous. The family eventually feels compelled to move to Paris, however, where Brigitte finds herself not quite belonging to either culture. Trondheim brings to life Findakly's memories to create a poignant family portrait that covers loss, tragedy, love, and the loneliness of exile. End quote. Outlining her work as a colorist, not included in this memoir, according to her Goodreads profile, quote, Findakly has worked as a colorist since 1982 with work for Disney and Spiro. She also colored a number of graphic novels, including The Rabbi's Cat, The Spiffy Adventures of Mikani, and Ralph Azam. End quote. Speaking of which, I definitely need to reread and re-review The Rabbi's Cat. Trondheim's Goodreads profile describes him as, quote, the phenomenal Lewis Trondheim is never where you next expect him. As an artist and writer, Trondheim has earned an international following as one of the most inventive, versatile, and prolific graphic authors. From autobiography to adventure, from best-selling fantasy and children's book to visual essays, Trondheim's unique, seminal imagination consistently dazzles. His work has won numerous awards, and he also co-created the Titanic fantasy epic Dungeon with Jan Svar. Lewis lives in the south of France with his wife Brigitte Findakly and 2 children. End quote. Keywords that came to mind: war, family, diaspora, history, conversation, and education. Politically, Findakly includes references to different actions taken by the Iraq government and other historical events, alongside her own personal story. But in-depth political commentary did not appear to be the goal of Poppies of Iraq, although I feel like I could have easily missed it through my own naivete. Partly, this is no doubt due to Findakly spending most of the book as a child, with her adult years happening more at a distance after her family moves to France. It could also be partly a reflection of the level of censorship her Iraq family lived under. That was a strong theme throughout the book. That said, Findakly does clearly have a perspective, being middle class, having access to French citizenship, and being part of the Orthodox Christian minority. Overall, I do prefer my nonfiction to have a clear perspective, as true objectivity does not actually exist. In this instance, I clearly can't just stop here and not seek out more stories from Iraq. Writing-wise, I felt that Poppies of Iraq really drew me in and kept me pretty engrossed. A lot of reviewers on Goodreads commented that they found the vignettes confusing, which was certainly not my personal experience. Each short slice of her family's life built on the last, with a sprinkling of single pages dedicated either to, quote, in Iraq, culture segments, or family photographs. If you like slice of life, I feel like you will not have any trouble following along. As far as the art goes, I really fell in love with the art. Gender was one of the things that Findakly does highlight throughout her selection of stories, and while there's clearly ways that her family that stayed in Iraq longer is more conservative when it comes to gender roles, the spectrum represented looks very similar to the spectrum I grew up around in a conservative Christian American home. We are partaking in something other than the Orientalist feminist gaze that says we need to save women from non-Western countries for being particularly more oppressed. Sexuality is a monolith of heterosexuality, although I do appreciate how her own sexuality and romantic interests are not something Findakly seems to want to talk about. Not that I have any problem with people talking about their sexuality and romantic entanglements and proclivities, but it helped to keep the heteronormativity at a distance. Race is talked about less than religious difference, although there is one interesting call-out to a person who is adamant that all Arabs are Muslim. As I mentioned, Findakly's family is Orthodox Christian and Arab. Depicting herself growing up, Findakly depicts several instances of positive relationships with the Muslim community around her. That said, I was personally disappointed by the closing page talking about after all her family has left Iraq, when Findakly writes, quote, many of my family have clung to the one thing they could take with them, their Christian faith, and all have become Islamophobic. I'm not judging them. I won't try to argue. I'll continue to love them as they are, as people I care about. End quote. Obviously, as someone who has relatives who hold various kinds of bigoted views, things do get complicated. How much pressure to exert at different times, and choices about who to cut out entirely versus who you need to work on, and which relatives you hardly see at all or have no sway over. I feel like the way she puts it, it's clear that Findakly does not want to agree with her relatives. Not bringing up this reality of her relatives would be whitewashing over this issue, but this public announcement proclaiming she will absolutely do nothing seemed rather insensitive at the very least. While Findakly's middle-class life is largely implicit outside of the book blurb, the issue of class does come up a few times, particularly when Anissa is hired to help around the house and becomes friends with Findakly. Paging through Poppies for Iraq, ability versus disability does come up once or twice. The most prominent example is Findakly's father, who we follow fairly closely through his career as a dentist and then as an interpreter, and also as he nears the end of his life. Full warning, he does reach a point where he feels too disabled and wants to die. Findakly does appear to talk him out of this. So to wrap up, I think I'll be rating this 3 out of 5 stars. Bye y'all, keep reading and resist white supremacy. And Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, an Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.